Ladies, gentlemen, first, as a brother in arms, I want to thank you for your service. I graduated from West Point in 2004. I became a Ranger qualified Apache pilot and flew 750 hours combat in Operation Iraqi Freedom. We fought in different wars, but we all stood up for this nation. Our service continues today. You answered the call initially because of something deep down in your soul that taught you, that told you that you had an obligation, not an option, to continue your service and give back, even to the point where you felt called, putting yourself in grave danger to answer those in the world who also share what we believe: all men created equal, all men and women allowed to breathe free, and protecting American ideals are things that you did, putting your lives on the line to protect those. I want to personally thank you for your service. You've said many times that there is a feeling that's palpable amongst the American people that we have betrayed our allies and we have betrayed those who stood up with us during our time of need, and we abandoned them in theirs. We also got some feedback on addressing the 72,000 who are already over here in a probationary status, and also care teams not being funded. My first question is, in the little recess that we've had, it's been a long day, I grant you that, and I appreciate it. But are there any other things that we can do right now, any gaps that we can address in Congress to make sure that that we can make amends for this retreat in some small way?
Congressman, I'd like to answer. There's been mention before of the Afghan Adjustment Act. I am personally in favor of passing that act. I believe it's a bipartisan negotiated framework. It provides the adjustment of the status that the Afghans that are here that don't have currently a pathway to citizenship. It enlarges SIV eligibility, and it reinserts Congress's prerogative in this area. And so I think a number of folks that are sitting behind me also support it, and we've advocated for that in the past.
If I could just offer one thing, Congressman. On top of that, I believe I had spoken earlier about the NMRG, the National Mine Reduction Group. This group of individuals was actually not part of the Afghan Special Operations community, but were rather specially trained by Afghan SOF for force protection and mine clearing. Therefore, they're eligible right now for SIV. They're extremely organized, very coherent, and there are groups right now that are in this room that are actively guiding them, and I believe could be one of the first big wins in how we get the most at-risk Afghans over here post-blast. And I think looking at the NMRG as our first look for severely at-risk groups to get over here because they're already SIV eligible, if we could lean in with the private groups that are working that right now, I think we could see an immediate success.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Congressman. That's really, I think the most important thing we can do is really focus on what we can do now. There are so many things, the things that fall within Congress's purview, just to kind of go down some of the things within the Afghan Adjustment Act, right? 72,000 people, many of whom are applying for asylum right now, who, that is not a system that's designed to handle it, and it's already incredibly backlogged. So by creating a separate pathway, it will allow all of those 72,000 to go through an additional vetting process, but also provide for their continued employment status, all of the things that come with immigration status, and prevent them from falling into, right, not just being out of status and subject to deportation hearing, but employment authorizations and all these other things. So just to double down on how important that is, some of the other provisions that were within that act that failed to pass in December and then March last year include expanding the SIV program for folks like Lieutenant Colonel Mann is talking about, both the NMRG group, the FTPs, certain Afghan Special Forces groups. So, we needed the Afghan Adjustment Act yesterday. We really needed it last year because we are coming up on this parole deadline for so many people. And it's going to affect, in St. Louis, our local communities, employers who took, a lot of responsibility on giving these people jobs. If those folks fall out of employment authorization status, that affects them and their ability to make a living, but also, it's going to make it difficult for small businesses in the future to be able to, hire refugees and people who make our communities better. More oversight on the State Department on the SIV program. We need better numbers and data data in order to know where we need to make those changes, software updates, just more funding for that program particularly, and more oversight. So when those fixes don't happen, Congress can call them to account. Like, we really need like a strong congressional oversight presence on these programs, in addition to keeping them funded and viable. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. Thank you for your service. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. James. Mr. James yields back. Mr. Moskowitz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me just say thank you all for your service. As a representative of the American government, I think Democrats and Republicans who made these decisions together owe you not just a debt of gratitude, but an apology. You don't just deserve our thanks, but you deserve someone to look you in the eye and say that they're sorry for the decisions that they made. You deserve accountability. This was a clear American failure. It wasn't a partisan failure. And it's funny, I didn't hear one of the witnesses assign any political blame, because we all know that the venom of politics are not going to get you the answers that you need. It's not going to get you the accountability that you need, and it's not going to prevent this from happening to young servicemen and women again. Mr. Huang, you said that we should rise above political differences. I'm afraid we may not be capable of doing that any longer. I hope as we investigate this issue further, I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we are able to do that. You are all heroes, and there are heroes on this committee. There are heroes who have seen the horrific images that you have seen, the sights, the smells, and have lost limbs. I've never seen that on the battlefield. But I did see it in my own neighborhood and in my own high school in Parkland, when a gunman walked into my high school and killed 17 people, including 14 kids. I was at the school within hours. I saw the images, the parents, the screaming, the funerals, the memorials. I can't imagine the mental health impact of what you all dealt with, the invisible scars that you have to experience. I want to thank you for coming and sharing your stories and experiences with us. One of the lesser known stories about the tragedy that happened in my hometown and at my high school is that the federal government had been given information before the shooting of who the shooter was and that the shooting was imminent. And the federal government did nothing with that information. They failed to act. And so I know firsthand about what it's like when lives are on the line and government fails. When they make mistakes, it can have catastrophic consequences. And so what I want to focus on is I want to focus on accountability for the gaps, and I want to focus on how do we solve these problems so that they don't happen again. And so what I want to do is I want to hear from you, Sergeant Vargas Andrews, because I found your testimony to be compelling and honest. You don't need to hear from me. I want to hear from you. I think the American people deserve to hear from you. So I'm going to yield you the balance of my time so that you can talk about whatever else you want to talk about that you think we should know and how we could prevent something like this from happening again.
Thank you very much, Congressman. What I'll start with is that another member of the committee made the comment that there should be more oversight on the State Department, ensuring that they're prepared, and in the future that that those actions by the State Department, those in charge of them, are more proactive than reactive. Obviously, changes now will be due to situations like this that have occurred, but a lack of preparedness at a lot of levels of leadership are the reason why, August 26, 2021 happened the way it did, and that those 2 weeks happened the way that they did, as well as on the military side of things, ensuring that rules of engagement in such a high-tension environment. It's not like we were just getting sent on patrols to to go into villages and things like that. We were Marines, infantrymen, forced to do a humanitarian aid mission gone wrong. And, you know, I won't say wrong. A lot of lives are saved, but in a lot of ways there are many issues that arose with it. And any way that the committee can help to enforce that between the State Department and the military. Back to you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Self, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Colonel Mann, I'm retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and a Green Beret, the second after my colleague, Mr. Waltz. I was in Bagram early in the war, though, in 2002, and I was also down in Kabul. And as early as it was, before the big buildup, it was obvious to me that Bagram was defensible, Kabul was not. By the way, I asked a friend of mine, Big John, I'll not use his last name, I asked Big John if he had any hints for me for this hearing, and he said, no, Scotty Mann will present my position adequately. So I appreciate you doing that because I think you spoke for Big John, who is, for everyone else, Big John was in a different task force, not Task Force Pineapple. From what I've heard today, and I'm glad, frankly, that I had a chance to step out because I think I was hearing echoes of the past from another Democrat from 2012 era where we lost 4 soldiers, 4 service members in a place called Benghazi, excuse me. And the saying at that time was, what difference does it make? It makes a difference. It makes a difference that this committee is going to hold someone accountable. And I intend to join my colleague, Mr. Waltz, and my colleague, Mr. Perry, in demanding that this committee hold someone accountable for this. I also want to comment on one, and before I do that, I want to say thanks for everybody coming. None of us want to relive our experiences in the Middle East, and I regret that you have had to do that in this public of a forum. I try not to do this with my wounded warrior friends, and I thank you for doing it. We continue to pay a price around the world. We're focused on this 2-week period probably in Afghanistan, but we continue to pay the price around the world with the perceived weakness of America. And notice I didn't say the weakness of America because I echo the comments of one of the panel members that the American people are still strong. We just have weak leaders. We continue to pay the price around the world, specifically in Ukraine, because immediately after this debacle, Putin started moving forces and equipment into place to invade Ukraine. I've also heard comparisons to Vietnam. These two do not compare. I personally know General Kerry and Tony Wood, who were responsible for planning and executing the last evacuation of Saigon, and they had to do it surreptitiously because of State Department and senior military reticence to even let them plan the operation. So history does repeat itself, and if we want to make sure that the future is not like the past, then we will get to the bottom of this. I don't have any questions. I know where you've been. I've been there. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Jackson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd first like to give a very special, heartfelt thank you to each of you for coming, and like to also apologize in advance for the pain that you endure, that you suffer, and that we ask you to recount over and over again for the wounds that have not healed it, for the friends and family that have been also casualties from your pain and sacrifices. I would like to ask you, Mr. Hong, if you could please weigh in on what's working or what needs to be further fixed in the Afghan Act?
Thank you, Congressman. So the Afghan Adjustment Act, like I mentioned, is, I think, one of three things that Congress should look at going forward. Passing that act, as my fellow panelist, Mr. Lucier mentioned, adjusts the status of various Afghans, enlarges that status, and also reinserts Congress's appropriate role in oversight. Second, as I mentioned earlier, Congress should strongly look at any way to enable the executive branch to increase the capacity and throughput of both processing SIVs, P1s, P2s, and then relocating those individuals once they qualify for immigration status. And third, I echo the comments made by various members that we need to conduct thoughtful, non-political accountability with the goal of preventing what happened in August 2021 from ever happening again.
Thank you. Ms. Mackler, would you like to add anything to that, please? On the Afghan Adjustment Act, on what's working at the State Department or what should be improved?
There's various questions there. On the Afghan Adjustment Act, I think it's a thoughtful piece of legislation that's been worked on by both sides and probably represents the best that we can do right now for Afghans who are here and for allowing for continued relocations. I think it is urgent that it pass. We need to give the Afghans who are here need the confidence to know that they have pathways and that their future is not uncertain past August. On the State Department, I think there were many decision failures and systemic failures along the way, and I've sort of spoken about that today. I will say that since August 15th, 2021, we have seen innovation and we have seen them step up, probably not enough. And chronically, these agencies are under-resourced and underfunded. We need the SIV system. We need to clear the backlogs to start with. And so we need resources in these agencies to adjudicate these applications, to clear backlogs, not just the SIV backlogs, which are phenomenal, but also, for example, family petitions. Many Afghans who are here, I was just working with a young man, an SIV recipient, because he was an interpreter in Afghanistan, who is now a U.S. citizen, who has no way of bringing his parents because of the, some of his family members, because of the backlogs that continue, his siblings and such. So even in the family-based immigration system, for example, we need to be resourcing these various areas so that they can function better. I think at the State Department, the CARE team has shown us what public-private partnership can look like and how effective it can be, and so we need to resource that. We should create the Ombudsman for Allies office, probably within the Department of State, to make sure that these issues no longer happen. I think these are all starts. These are all in my written testimony if you need more details.
Thank you very much. And if you will, if I can call you Colonel Mann, promotion. For the soldiers that are home, and I know it doesn't necessarily fall within our jurisdiction, but what can we do for the soldiers? It pains me. It's agonizing. I was once a professor, and to see so many young soldiers, I felt your pain. I can't imagine what you've gone through at your age to deal with friends and comrades that have died, and to feel abandoned once you've come home, and to feel as if you've abandoned a mission. Again, you did not abandon your mission. It was wrong on this side. You were right. I congratulate you, applaud you, appreciate you. But Colonel Mann, what can we do for our soldiers, veterans, so they can feel the love and support and respect they deserve?
Thank you for that, Congressman. I would just say one of the big things I think we need to do is we need to explore and get deeper on what moral injury is. Right now, it's really, it's something that people are talking a lot about, but I think there needs to be a lot more work on what it really is and getting it integrated into the mental health system so that we understand it and that we recognize it as a very, very serious thing. Again, there's a recent study by a group called More in Common that says 67% of Afghan war veterans feel betrayed. That is the devil's cocktail if we don't get in front of that. So I think exploring that, and then again, I think our senior leaders at every level on both sides of the political aisle and both retired and active military leaders need to dive into this moral injury issue with some level of acknowledgement that it has happened, and then we have to work together to put measures in place that will assure those folks that have been affected by this that it won't happen again. Because otherwise, most of the folks affected by this, they're not going to come along because they're just going to wait for it to happen again. Except this time, it's going to be their kids. And I think that's why we're seeing issues with recruiting, retention, public trust in the military has dropped, 11 points since the collapse. So I think the leadership involvement on this and really getting honest and talking about it, both in the active duty community, reserve community, and in the retired officer and senior enlisted community, that's what it's going to take to move from injury to recovery.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Kim is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank the committee chair and the ranking members for convening this hearing so we can hear directly from you who have served and experienced during the Afghan withdrawal. And so I want to thank you for being here and enduring these long hours, telling your stories. And this is the beginning of hopefully not only do we do the accountability of what actually happened, but how can we prevent going forward, but at the same time bring some, amplify the stories of what happened so we don't repeat the same mistakes. You guys really stepped up when the administration let so many down, and along the way you saved so many lives. So I want to let you know that your service will never be forgotten, and we will not let your stories go untoward, which is why we're having this hearing. So I want to thank you. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was very difficult for veterans who served to watch. In fact, according to the Department of Veterans Affairs, the calls that were made to the Veterans Hotline really increased about 98%, almost 100%, between August 14 and August 29. So you can see this was very, very difficult time for the veterans. So we owe it to you, the veterans who served in Afghanistan, to get answers to what went wrong during that withdrawal. And I see this hearing as an venue, an avenue to those conversations that we're starting. During that process, we saw Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore sending personnel to assist with the evacuation. So did Japan and South Korea, sending a few aircraft to also assist in that evacuation process. And my office worked very closely with the Canadian government when we couldn't get answers from our government. So I want to know what your coordination was like, if any, with other countries, servicemen and women on the ground. And let me ask specifically Mr. Hong and Mr. Mann, was our State Department helpful in coordinating that, and was it mostly coordinated through other foreign ministries or amongst personnel on the ground?
Thank you, Congresswoman. For our September 17th flight, in order for it to take off, we needed 4 different authorizations. We needed permission from the Taliban to depart Afghanistan. We needed permission to fly into Qatari airspace. We needed permission to land at Al Udeid and prioritization to be, put our personnel there. We had to negotiate all those things without a diplomatic relationship with the new government of Afghanistan, and in a situation that was very, very dynamic. Prior to the departure of the United States from Afghanistan on August 30th, there was a task force in place at the State Department to coordinate all those things, and there was a very clear process. I distinctly remember on the day that we announced that our country's diplomatic and military presence had ended in Afghanistan, that task force ended operations, and we were specifically told that at this point the evacuation was over, that private citizens needed to figure out their own solution, and I was at a loss, as were my co-organizers. Luckily, while the official State Department task force had ended, there were individuals in the State Department who still cared, who stepped up, who tried to figure out solutions for us and other private volunteer groups, despite the lack of clear authorities and clear policies on this. They are also unsung heroes in this, and they were working inside the bureaucracy. But yes, it was very difficult, Congresswoman, to figure out how to get a plane off the ground in a country where we no longer had a presence.
That's really speaking volume that members of Congress and our veterans and the evacuation support system, they had to rely on other nations to help our citizens and allies in a time of need. If you can add to that, please.
I'll just build on that. I think that there were outstanding individuals that went above and beyond the call within the State Department to help us get folks in. But what I will say is that overall, it was very, very difficult to coordinate with the State Department during the evacuation. I think we got better. And I think the private-public partnership that was displayed by these volunteer groups with the government and the State Department is probably precedent-setting, and I don't think it's going away. Future crises like this, we're going to continue to see it, so we need to figure it out. And then the other thing that I would just say is that I think that the private groups came up with a lot of solutions, proposed solutions that were very viable with potential third countries and places to go, lily pads. And it seemed to me that they were dismissed out of hand as these weren't viable groups or viable organizations, but yet they were the very people that were turned to whenever someone needed to get out in dire straits. And so I think listening to these private groups more and putting their solutions into play, because they have a lot of really good ideas on third countries and other options. And I think the State Department listening to them more and opening the aperture more for that dialogue is critical.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Crow is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you. I want to reiterate what I said a little while ago about your heartfelt testimony, which I have found to be compelling with all of you, candid, honest, and incredibly insightful, and I appreciate your service then and now going forward so we can have this discussion. There's been a lot of talk about this being America's longest war. This is not just an August of 2021 issue, although it is absolutely worth diving deep into August of 2021. But over 2,400 Americans gave their lives during this war. Countless Afghans gave their lives. 2 decades, 4 administrations, 10 Congresses. A lot of talk about a moral failure, and there have been several moral failures that have occurred. One of them has happened within the United States Congress, because it is the U.S. Congress that has the authority and the obligation to decide matters of war and peace, and to force conversations, tough conversations, about these issues, about SIV programs, about refugee programs, about authorizations for use of military force. And we have abdicated time and time and time again to this day. We have abdicated that authority, and it's time to take it back, to force that conversation, because we owe it to you, and we owe it to all of our veterans to do so. A couple of facts remain, though. Number one, there was no status quo. This notion that there was a status quo in August of 2021 that could have continued is not true. President Biden inherited a deal that was signed by President Trump, and at the end of that deal, when it came time for our troops to leave, the Taliban were going to launch a massive all-out assault on U.S. forces. We had 2,000 troops in country at that time, and they couldn't have defended themselves, and they couldn't have defended the Afghans. So we would have had to have plussed up to 15,000, 20,000, 25,000, pick a number. It would have been a massive surge, and we'd be fighting and dying to this day. And I don't believe that we should have done that. The last is the evacuation. The problems, the challenges, the missteps with the evacuation have been well documented. You have helped illustrate those further. I agree with you. We have to be honest about that. My criticisms of the administration have been well documented. And we have to be honest about that challenge so we make sure it never happens again. I want to make sure, though, when we're having that discussion, that we are clear on the civil servants, those in the State Department, those in the Defense Department, that poured their hearts and souls also into this to protect the people that they fought with and served with. I have had countless conversations where those civil servants, those men and women, have broken down into tears because they, too, lost friends and left friends behind. And I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of people within this administration and going forward have done that work. So with that in mind, Ms. Mackler, I'd like to turn to you. We've talked a lot about the SIV program. I've done a lot of work on that program, as have many of you. But I want to talk a little bit more in the time that we have left on the non-SIV elements that we have to address. All of those civil society leaders, judges, girls, women, journalists, others who are fighting to get out, who can't do so under the SIV program. But we need to expand the P1, P2, other programs. What do we need to do? And how do we get those folks prioritized?
Thank you, Congressman. That is such a great question. The P1, P2 programs are refugee resettlement programs. They require an individual to have worked for a U.S. Military contractor, NGO, or media organization, and to be referred into that program by those individuals. So we've been getting a lot of questions recently about that, about the new sponsor circles and refugee sponsor circles that were recently announced by the Department of State. None of that will help. Really, quite frankly. And the individuals that you're talking about, the civil servants, the lawyers, the judges, everybody else in civil society who built up Afghanistan, modeled on the promise that we made them of the Afghanistan that we promised them, they have, quite frankly, no options. And sometimes we've been able to, for those who have who have education, we've been able to get, fellowships, using visas for internships, all very temporary solutions, all very visas for performers, visas for scientists, things like that. But the options are just, frankly, very, 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 very limited.
Do we need a new category of visa to address these folks?
We need a new category of visas to have our immigration policies and laws reflect the labor needs that this country has right now and the economic needs that this has right now. I mean, this goes to the agricultural sector, the industrial sector, as much as the more highly educated sectors and fields. I mean, right now you can come and study in our universities and then not stay because there are no visa options for you, even though you've been educated here. And so across the board, we need more pathways, more generous pathways. And then in addition to that, we need to clear the backlogs. There are a lot of folks who would be able to bring family members, who would be able to bring others, who are choosing not to come because they would have to leave family behind. And a lot of that is just sort of caught up in the backlog. So I would start there. And I would also just say, I know we're out of time, but I would also say, things that don't require legislative fixes, but just put in more resources into these agencies that are chronically underfunded so that we can get through the applications. Right now, it takes a year to get a work permit.
Gentleman yields back. I ask unanimous consent the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing without objective so ordered. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. First, let me join with my colleagues today. It's been a long day, and thank each of you for your testimony before the committee in a forthright way. It's all appreciated, and you can tell that on both sides of the aisle how meaningful your personal testimonies about the tragedies in August of 21 were. And to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are making sure that this is a bipartisan catastrophe, I believe that there have been mistakes made for 22 years in a variety of ways as it relates to any war we fight, particularly the war fought in Afghanistan. But let's be clear. If we knew we were leaving at the beginning of the Biden administration, based on the Trump administration, then where was the plan? Where was the plan to properly evacuate? And as my friend Mr. Crow knows, we had two briefings, one in April of 21 and one in July of 21 or June of 21, in the House of Representatives, classified briefings, bipartisan. And the veterans who fought in Afghanistan were the most skeptical of what we were listening to in the spring of 21 and early summer of 21, briefed by the IC, the intelligence community, and the military about the plan, because there was no evidence of a plan. So we may well not have had a choice but to leave, but how you leave is a choice. And it could have been done, in my view, in an extraordinarily more effective manner, and it was a failure not of intelligence, but of political and leadership failure, in my view. And I agree with the witness that have suggested that that this led and contributed to Putin's calculus about what would come next. Since it is International Women's Day, let me start with my trip to Kabul in 2015, when I witnessed firsthand Afghanistan's steps in a positive way then for social progress with the help of the United States and without the brutal control of the Taliban. On that trip, I met a young woman, Naeed Azhar, who was from Jalalabad, and I took tea with her that afternoon, and she was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Arkansas, earning a master's degree in anthropology, and she wanted to be home in Afghanistan with her career as an independent researcher and writer. And before what happened in 21, that just reminded me of what a future of a free Afghanistan might have looked like. And we abandoned our allies and our innocent civilians like Naeed to the Taliban. Colonel Mann, thanks for your testimony, and especially your focus on Afghan women. And I've seen firsthand that positive force that they were playing in Afghan civil society before our withdrawal. How much process on the status of women has been undone under the Taliban regime?
Thank you, Congressman. I feel pretty underqualified to address this in the sense that I believe, hopefully, where this will go. I mean, I'm going to try to address it, but I think in the future, hopefully, we'll have a range of women leaders on the panels as well addressing this. Hopefully, from Afghanistan as well, because I think there is so much that we need to dig into on this. What I can tell you is what I'm hearing from leaders of the group sitting behind me right now that are very engaged with at-risk Afghans in country, and of course people that we've worked with in Task Force Pineapple. And what we have done is to literally wind the clock back to a pre-9/11 draconian civil society in Afghanistan where women and girls are relegated to not much more than property, if that. And the atrocities that are occurring at a humanitarian level right now against women and girls are unconscionable. And I can tell you in interviewing Minister Hasina Safi, the Minister of Women's Affairs, when we were talking about that day when everything fell apart, I'll paraphrase what she said was, everyone in the West for years has talked about advancing women's rights in the world and advancing women's rights in Afghanistan, but on the day we needed it most, it was nowhere to be found.
Thank you. And I agree completely. And I hope we do have a panel as we explore the wrongs of this evacuation process, women. I appreciate your testimony. I'm proud to be with you. I want to thank all the groups that worked doing the job that the State Department should have done. We still have cases in my office unresolved. And when I visited Quantico to meet SIVs, 6,000 people at Quantico, there were less than 100 that were SIVs. And we did not take care of the SIVs in this process. Now I yield back. Now recognize my friend Mr. Barrett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, I want to recognize Sergeant Vargas Andrews. You're from Folsom, California. I had the privilege of representing Folsom in a prior Congress. I also want to recognize all the veterans here, but their family members and everyone who's served over the years for your service. When I meet a veteran, I don't know if they're a Democrat or a Republican, and when they serve, they're just meeting the task that's in front of them, the mission that they've been given. So thank you and be proud of that. I'm glad that my colleague, Representative Green, talked about that. You should be proud of your service. We're proud of your service. So for all the veterans, the men and women that served and their families, thank you for that, and we're proud of you. But Lieutenant Colonel Mann, you did talk about the healing process and what we need to do in the pain, and we certainly saw it with Vietnam veterans who returned and suffered in silence for years. Let's learn from that. Let's try to start the healing process, and we've touched on a couple things that we could actually do. We can't rewrite the past, but we can, by understanding the past, understanding mistakes, learning from those mistakes, we should do that oversight, and I think we all agree upon that. We should not abandon the Afghans that helped us, that supported us, their family members. I'm proud to represent Sacramento County, which I think is the largest, has the largest population of Afghan refugees. I know my staff in those days in August and September, submitted over 10,000 names for humanitarian parole. The calls that they were getting, were heartbreaking. And I know all of our staffs were going through a lot of those calls, along with many of the veterans. We should honor that. We've touched on the Afghan Adjustment Act. Ms. Mackler, let me ask you a question. If we don't pass that act by August, what's going to happen?
Tens of thousands of Afghans who are evacuated will remain in limbo at risk of deportation, unable to begin their lives, unable to move past this moment and keep going towards safety and protection.
So to my Republican colleagues, to my Democratic colleagues, that is a tangible thing that we can do. We can pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. We can certainly protect the folks that are here. State Department was overwhelmed. I'm glad that some on the panel have talked about the individual members who stepped up and went beyond their call of duty. Let's fix this problem. Let's continue to get folks out of Afghanistan, family members, women, and others that are at risk to the best of our ability. We can do that. Lieutenant Colonel, you touched on the moral injury, and we certainly have to think about what that looks like, understand it, and then think about what we need to do to heal that moral injury. Do you have some thoughts on how we should approach that?
The one thing that I haven't covered yet is we did one of the guys in Pineapple did an interview with a gentleman named George who lives in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And George has been very, very active. He's as a former Green Beret in evacuating partners into North Carolina and settling onto farmland that he's helped them acquire. The interesting thing about George as a Green Beret is the indigenous partners that he's evacuating are Montagnards. He's a Vietnam-era Green Beret who has been evacuating Montagnards for decades. And his nonprofit has been doing this very, very successfully. And when asked, George, how long are you going to do this? And he said, until I'm dead. And I think the point that this goes back to one of the comments that was made earlier, I believe it was by Congresswoman Titus, about why weren't we, talking to the Trump administration and previous administrations about what was going on. The reality is we were living our lives. We were running our businesses. We were running our nonprofits. We were raising our kids. We had run the miles as veterans and had completed our times of service. And we were drawn back into this, not of our own volition, but by a set of circumstances that we could not stand for, that we couldn't, people ask me why I got involved with this. I said, because my 3 boys are watching me right now. And, so my point is, this is going to continue to go. And what we've got to do is to find a way to responsibly relieve the veterans of this burden, or the moral injury recovery is going to be very difficult.
Well, and that's something that we have in our power, that we should do and undertake as bipartisan members of Congress, to think about how we can work with the State Department administration to address that and relieve you of some of that burden, but to get the mission done, as you did. Thank you. And I'll yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Mills for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thanks for everyone who's here on this panel. Like many of you on this panel, I too served. And I'm proud to say that I was an Army combat veteran who had served and had spent time not just in Iraq, but also time in Afghanistan. But I'm also one that'll actually call things the way they are. We've allowed our operations to continue to be drug out, modified, changed with no clear military objectives. And the minute that we thought that we were nation builders, we had already lost our way. That is not the intent of the United States Armed Forces. You want counterterrorism, you want counterinsurgency strategies, we'll be the ones to go to. You want policing and nation building, that's not our role. So it was a failed strategy from the beginning whenever we actually got into that. You want to deal with FID strategies? I know that Lieutenant Colonel Mann knows all about being able to train asymmetrics and to be able to understand foreign internal defense. And all of you know what it is like to sacrifice. And that means a lot to me. The same people who will come in this room, my colleagues on the left, and say, we should not politicize this, and yet politicize it. These are the same individuals that what they're really trying to say, and I'll go ahead and translate, is that we don't really want to uncover and actually have accountability for who is responsible and claims to be the commander-in-chief. That's what this is about. We left Americans behind. We left our Afghan allies behind to die. And we have to accept that. Like many of you, I couldn't sit there with my hands tied. Because we all have to, when we die, answer for our talents and say, we had a capacity, a capability, a skill set that we could utilize. So my team actually had gotten put together after Congressman Ronnie Jackson had called me and told me about this woman, Miriam, and her 3 children who were born and raised Amarillo, Texas natives, who were being left behind by the Biden administration. He called the DOD for help. They told him they were in the midst of withdrawal. He called the State Department. They told him they had text to find out where she was. Go to this gate. You can get in. Just wave your blue passport. There's an agreement with the Taliban. And we all know that was false. So instead of worrying about my political run in my candidacy, we put a team together of former squadron members, and we flew over there and actually attempted to rescue 28 AMSITs in our G650 who, with approved PPRs, our plane actually being modified with the carriage of a humanitarian aircraft. And as we're 2,000 off the feet on final approach, we were denied entry, which resulted in multiple different changes in our platform, but ultimately we wouldn't be deterred, and we did conduct the very first successful overland rescue, making sure that mother, her 15-year-old son, her 11-year-old daughter, her 2-year-old daughter were allowed to come back to the country that they're a part of. You guys know something about that. And we will get answers. There will be accountability. And I'll have resignations or impeachments one way or another. Now, speaking on that, Sergeant, do you feel that if you would have been enabled to have actually have gone with the green light to take out what you had identified as a bolo, that would have prevented the incident that occurred on August 26 and preserved the 13 U.S. service members' lives?
Thank you, Congressman. What I can say is that a worst-case scenario of the individual that we fired upon, who we suspected to be the bomber, not being the bomber, someone in the crowd who is the bomber is going to think twice when they see someone else's face get caved in or their chest get caved in and killed. They're going to understand that America's paying attention, that we're going to take action for the things that are occurring and the threats that were prevalent during that time there.
I completely agree. And we know the psychological impact on the battlefield that a sniper can actually produce. Lieutenant Colonel Mann, do you believe that if we would have maintained our presence in Bagram Air Base with the force protection capabilities, but also the ability to have those buildings to do proper vetting so we didn't put over 70% of people unvetted onto this successful Operation Airlift, and I will use the actual rabbit ears, that we could have run 2 simultaneous runways, not just on HKIA but Bagram, and actually have led to a more successful and safer mission on the evacuation?
I do, Congressman. And I believe we could have also leveraged the power of the groups, of the volunteer groups, to assist in that as well in a more orderly and organized fashion.
You know, I'll tell you something. I'm sure that others in this room has actually incurred it as well. You know, after we had actually attempted to do multiple rescues of Americans and was thwarted by the Biden administration on multiple occasions, when we did finally get a successful evacuation, do you know what the CNN first headline was? State Department saves 4 Americans. And it wasn't until I went on to Hannity and I went on to McCallum and I started blasting the fact that this was untrue with photos just like the one I have behind me, did they actually retract their statements. Guess what? America is not defined by the United States government. America is defined by the American citizens who are not willing to sit back and do nothing. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Comliger-Dev.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all of you all for spending today with us. I know it's been long. I especially want to thank our service members for your heroism and your sacrifice. It takes courage to serve our country, and it also takes courage to share your stories and your pain. As your testimonies highlight, which I read before coming here, when it comes to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, it is imperative that this committee conduct robust oversight and engage in a full interrogation of all the facts in order to uncover lessons we desperately need to learn about the failure of our involvement in Afghanistan. You all have made powerful points about the obligation that we have as a country to help those who suffer from persecution and tyranny. What started in August 2021 is far from finished, and the test of our commitment to our Afghan partners is not about what happened just over those 2 weeks, but the way we continue to support them in the months and years ahead. So, Ms. Mackler, you pointed out that the administrative burden of putting together an application is on the applicant at risk, even for information the United States government already has access to. I know that Project Rabbit is a new effort by DoD to verify the employment of SIV applicants who worked with DoD contractors. From your perspective, has this mechanism improved processing times, and are there any successes that we can implement in other parts of the application process?
Yes, absolutely. From everything I understand, the DoD's Project Rabbit really did help move applications through. One of the peculiarities of the SIV program is that you require chief of mission confirmation that of the time in service, and that it meets all of the requirements, and that it was satisfactorily done. And that means that an applicant, often at risk or in danger, where they are, has to gather the paperwork that proves their employment, that proves their service, to reach out to the chief of their mission, who may no longer be, available, and to get them to issue the letters that they need. And so putting that burden back on the U.S. government, which in theory should have all of that paperwork far more easily accessible, instead of putting it on the applicant, who is often scrambling, often has no longer the connections or the ability to contact, especially when military personnel get deployed from one place to another or go up in rank, things like that. I mean, I was one time asked if I had a connection to General Petraeus, because that was who was needed to give the chief of mission approval, and I don't have him on my speed dial. So these things that create very real obstacles, and the chief of mission approval has been a bit of a drawing line in the sand. Without it, folks not only cannot continue with their SIV application, they aren't able to qualify for the relocation flights. When the administration did in end of July and August start moving SIV applicants into the United States, it had to be past that stage. And so expanding projects like Project Rabbit, from all accounts, would help speed that up. And in general, putting that burden back on the U.S. government to find within their files information they should already have would certainly ease the burden on the applicant.
Thank you for that. You also mentioned in your testimony disparate capabilities in the U.S. government's Uniting for Ukraine program, in contrast to the challenges of the Afghan system, especially when it comes to managing out-of-country processing. So can you provide some more detail as to what the differences are and what improvements are needed to ensure our treatment of Afghan refugees matches our treatment of Ukrainian refugees?
Sure. I mean, to put it simply, after the fall of Kabul, many Afghans who didn't qualify for any immigration options started applying for what's called humanitarian parole. I think at last count, over 70,000 applications were still pending, and the U.S. government told us that they had no ability to adjudicate them. Each application costs $575 per person. I mean, if you have a 6-month-old baby, you're paying $575 for you and $575 for your 6-month-old baby. These applications just kind of piled up, and they said they had no ability to adjudicate them. They had no ability to create a categorical program by which people could just apply based on an Afghan-related category. When the Ukraine invasion happened and the U.S. government looked at how to help Ukrainians who also needed protection, they created a categorical program to help people apply for parole and come to the United States. And I think that there are a lot of differences, both in terms of the experience, the resources, the personnel, the leadership that these departments had, but it is clear that the government could do it because they did it for Ukraine, so they should do it for Afghans as well.
Thank you. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Generally yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Who else?
What a great honor it is for me to be in your presence. I appreciate you serving your country. I appreciate you coming and being here with us today. Semper Fidelis. Part of the withdrawal, I noticed that when I was there in 2016, we lost an American serviceman, or another person died while we were there. But over the course of that last 10 years we were in Afghanistan, we didn't lose too many people, if I remember correctly. Would you all agree? For those of you who are historians of the Afghan war, in the last 10 years, we lost probably fewer than we lost that last day we withdrew. So I would make the case that with fewer people than we have stationed in Spain, a country we've never fought in, we stabilized an entire country in a very strategically important area. where now we have half the population in abject slavery because of their gender, where you now have a harboring nation of many bad guys who want to do bad things to good people. So I would make the case that maybe we shouldn't have withdrawn. It doesn't matter. I don't care who president is. I'm not going to make this political. And I find it ironic that some of the Democrat colleagues that I have here today say we shouldn't make this political, and then immediately the next sentence out of their mouth is it's Trump's fault. I don't really care. But I don't think we can start the healing process until we do have accountability, and I don't feel like we have that. And you talked about healing, Lieutenant Colonel. I want to talk to you as the senior ranking guy on the panel, at least for right now. For those members who haven't been through command and staff or war college, just some basic questions here. Let's see. Can a military leader move a date for any withdrawal anytime they please if they're the top guy or gal?
Like a withdrawal of forces? No.
So they can't decide what date they want to move out on?
I mean, if it's his operation.
Yeah. So for example, if you're the commander-in-chief, you can decide what date you want to leave, right?
Absolutely.
Are you married to any date that some prior commander who no longer is in charge, are you obligated to the date that they set previously?
It's typically event-driven.
Yeah. So you can decide, if you're the commander-in-chief, what date you want to withdraw and how you want to do it, correct? I mean, that's basic command leadership. You can decide, if you're in charge, you get to call the shots. I'm drawing this because I think if we want to blame somebody else for your leadership mistakes at that time, I think that's a false narrative, and I think that's been done several times during this argument of accountability. And I want to ask each one of you, because this is the important part. We're here to talk about one specific day and one specific withdrawal and one specific location. Do you think there was accountability for those people who made egregious mistakes, and I think we can all say somebody made egregious mistakes that day? Do you think those people were held accountable? Does anybody think that there was accountability, and if who was held accountable? So I'm assuming nobody here thinks that anybody's held accountable. So my question is, if we're going to have an entire hearing, we're going to have all these fine people who have sacrificed their lives, if we talk about traumatic brain injuries, limbs lost, family members lost, friends lost, time spent away from family, years away from our family. And then we look down the line and we say, not one person was held accountable that made these decisions. Then how can we learn and how can we heal? And that's my question to you. How are we? I'm getting emotional right now because this stuff matters. If we don't have accountability for the people who made those decisions, how can we heal as people and as a nation? And it's my humble opinion that we haven't had 1 ounce of accountability unless you can tell me where you've seen it. And if you can't, it's got to hurt you. And there was stone cold silence when I asked you if anybody's held accountable. That's how I feel too. And that's why we have suicide problems, in my opinion, as an ER doc who gets to witness people come into the ER with horrible PTSD and depression and suicidality because of this war. Do you guys have any other idea how we can heal without accountability? So have we done our job to hold those people who made the decisions, who were responsible for those decisions on that day in that theater? Have we held them accountable? And you're allowed to have an opinion. Matter of fact, there's nobody more qualified to have an opinion than you. Have we held anybody accountable?
Not yet, Chairman.
Thank you. And with that, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Lawler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing. Very straightforward hearing. During and after the fall of Kabul, examining the administration's emergency evacuation from Afghanistan. This is not a hearing about rehashing 20-plus years worth of policy. This is not a hearing about looking back as to why we went to Afghanistan in the first place. This is not a hearing about decisions made during the war. This is a hearing about the withdrawal and the epic failure of the administration with respect to that withdrawal. Let me say to each and every one of you, on behalf of the American people, I'm sorry. None of you should have been put in that situation. That is a failure of leadership. It is a failure of government. And it is a failure of our military leadership, not you. This should not have happened. For my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, who have spent the entirety of this hearing trying to figure out a way to not deal with the consequences of these decisions, but to somehow look and try to point fingers at prior administrations. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief. The buck stops with him. He had a responsibility. If he disagreed with the prior administration's handling, if he disagreed with the prior administration's plan, fix it. To set a date certain and then move that date up. I was a member of the New York State Legislature. I wasn't in Congress. I watched in horror as planes were taking off and you had people running down the tarmac trying to get on that plane so they could save their lives, the lives of their children, the lives of our service personnel, the lives of people in Afghanistan who worked closely with our men and women in uniform. It is shameful what happened. And as a citizen, not as someone who has served, not as somebody who was on the ground there, as a citizen, it was horrifying to watch. 13 service members dead. Their families gutted. All of you heartbroken. Dealing with the after effects of that. I know as a state representative dealing with our local veterans organizations, the increase in the number of people, veterans who were dealing with PTSD as a result of that, suicide, absolutely shameful. So this is about accountability, this is about transparency, and this is about ensuring this never, ever happens again. There's not one American who should ever be left on the ground in a war zone. And the people who sacrificed so much in Afghanistan to help us, to leave them there, an absolute disgrace. I note, Lieutenant Colonel, in your addendum on women and children, today is International Women's Day. To allow what has transpired since, shameful. All of you are owed a debt of gratitude from your government, from your country, and you are owed, more than anything, the truth. That, hopefully, in part, is what we were able to accomplish with this hearing today. So I thank you for your time and your testimony. God bless you all, and thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your vigilance in pursuing the truth in this committee. And thank you to our witnesses Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your service to our country. And thank you for doing what many in our government did not do, which is to work to help those who helped the United States in our fight against radical Islamic terrorism when we were there in Afghanistan. And some call this a chaotic withdrawal. Others call it an unconditional retreat. However you want to characterize it, it was a disgraceful episode and a failure of leadership to see 13 U.S. service members needlessly killed at HKIA because we didn't choose to use Bagram as a better alternative for extraction, and put our young men and women, many Marines, in a terrible situation, and our Afghan allies in a terrible situation, leading to not only leaving behind $7 billion worth of U.S. equipment in the hands of the Taliban, but leaving behind more than 800 American citizens and tens of thousands of our Afghan allies remaining there in jeopardy at the hands of bloodthirsty Taliban enemy after the last U.S. military aircraft departed August 31, 2021. Lieutenant Colonel Mann, this has been asked and probably answered in this lengthy hearing already, but based on your experience in the country, do you think it would have been a more effective plan to execute a withdrawal out of Bagram as opposed to HKIA?
Congressman, I do think it would have been more effective and more tenable to utilize Bagram as a platform for NEO.
Mr. Hong, in your testimony, you discussed your efforts to get both Americans and Afghan allies on planes out of Mazar al-Sharif and the fact that it took 3 weeks before they were able to depart. Can you please let this committee know what led to that 3-week delay? Was the Taliban the biggest hurdle? Was the State Department helpful or hurtful? And how were you able to overcome those hurdles?
All those things were hurdles, Congressman. We did not have a adequately sourced plan as far as we could tell. We were operating in conditions that the State Department, frankly, was unsure, individuals in the State Department unsure of their authorities and their resources. We had to figure out ways to negotiate with the new Taliban government for departure. We managed to overcome those things using, frankly, financial resources, number one. Number two, operational experience of the volunteers gained from hard-earned time on the ground in Afghanistan. And then three, relationships.
Well, I just can't thank you enough for doing, again, what the State Department was not able to do or should have been doing. And finally, I want to read into the record a letter I received from a constituent Marine who served at HKIA August 17 to August 31, 2021, and who, because of his experience, ended his active service prematurely. He says, I was an infantry machine gun squad leader, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines Bravo Company. Our company was running security operations in North Gate, HKIA. Within my first 2 hours at the gate, I saw Afghan soldiers shooting civilians as a warning for the other civilians to stop trying to overrun our position. Main orders were to keep Afghan civilians under control because of threat of suicide bomber was high. We would have to fight with men, women, and children with non-lethal weapons, firing warnings, shots from our weapons, hand-to-hand combat fighting all day. I watched men step on and kill children to get entry to the airport. I watched women throw their dead children into a sewage canal, where we would also take dead civilians who had died due to injuries sustained by the Taliban. Our chain of a woman handed me her dead infant and asked me to help, but I couldn't. Our chain of command directed us to throw flashbang grenades at civilians to calm them down, and none of us had ever used flashbangs before. My fellow Marines and I were in charge of kicking out, turning away desperate civilians who didn't have proper paperwork. Men, women, and even children would beg my fellow Marines and me to kill them. I had to inform Afghan man with his wife, baby, and multiple children he had to leave. He grabbed my rifle and begged me to kill him and his family because his entire family would be raped and burned alive by the Taliban, and I threw him out. I did everything I could to get them through, but my command told me to kick them out. I hit an older man in the head with a baton on accident, and I saw his head dent and his eyes roll back. I saw a woman get shot in the chest about 10 yards away. I had to fight through the crowd to defend her while our Navy corpsman gave her medical aid. Her crying children were on top of her. I was helping beat people back to make space. A man ran up to me saying it was his sister, and I was so angry I threw the man and jumped on top of him. I was about to hurt him until someone stopped me. Civilians like this man would try to pretend they were family of someone injured, and they were so desperate for understandable reasons. I remember one lady in particular had 2 young daughters dropping to her knees crying and asking us to kill her kids before the Taliban could get to them. Based on procedures put in place by the command, I still had to kick them out. I remember her telling me when her daughters are raped repeatedly, it would be my fault. For this administration, for this White House, for this State Department to put our Marines, like this young constituent of mine, in that position, to put our allies, our Afghan allies in this position, to put our U.S. service members who were killed at HKIA in this position is a disgrace. It is a disgrace. And there needs to be accountability for my Marine constituent who is no longer a Marine. Disgraceful. Thank you all for telling the truth, because the truth that is coming out today because of your testimony, the truth that comes out from my constituent, a brave Marine put in that position, that tells the story of a failure of leadership. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Last but not least, Mr. Nunn's recognized.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much, and to the Foreign Affairs Committee for having us here today. I want to first off thank the Gold Star families who joined us. I want to thank the veterans who stood up both in Afghanistan and beyond to help save lives. To the civilians, to the volunteers, to our allies across the board, many of us served in Afghanistan, and many more have served on Signal, in chat rooms, and at the wee hours of the morning while doing our main job to help save Americans, our allies, and the future of this country. Specifically, I want to thank Sergeant Vargas. You are a reflection of so many young men and women who went to serve our country in the best way possible. While you manned the post as a sniper, you provided countless hours of overwatch, protecting so many on the ground, including a young man from my district, a Marine, Specialist Deacon Page, who died at Abbey Gate. You knew the right thing to do. Leadership did not empower you to be able to save lives, and that is not on you. Thank you for your service. Beginning on the 26th of August, so many of you in this room, who I see both as friends, as allies, as a band of brothers and sisters who stood up, thank you. When HKIA fell, hundreds of Americans were left outside the wire. Thousands of our friends and allies who had stood with us for decades, putting their life ahead of ours, jeopardizing what their children and their future looked like to make sure we were able to get on those aircraft and fly out. I'm honored to be able to, just this week, honor Major Lunning, who was the last medical nurse to fly out with a group of Americans and Afghans on the C-17 that saved their lives as they traveled to Germany. Unfortunately, hundreds more had to be left behind. I want to tell briefly the story of the Syed family who was at the bombing at Abbey Gate. We first came into contact with him. I've done 3 combat tours, flying recon operations over, and our interpreter, who did 9 combat tours with us, was saved and is now a U.S. citizen in my community back home. But contacting us, they identified that this engineer, a grandfather, who had worked with the U.S. Embassy, who was promised evacuation, who went to Abbey Gate, was hit in the explosion. Despite the fact that he was mangled, the Taliban approached him. They said, "What did you do for the Americans? Why are you leaving our country?" He said, "I'm an engineer. I help build waterways." What is an engineer? I build a future for our country, for our children. They immediately shot him in the leg and left him for dead in the middle of the street in front of his children. Despite this, Mr. Syed walked across an open battlefield to save his 2 young children and his wife and asked for evacuation. We were working an operation at Mazar Sharif at the time, working with CAM Airways. Members who had never met each other, Americans and folks around the world, formed a group called Task Force Argo. And together we were able to get 5 flights out of Mazar Sharif in the north and save 3,000 Afghan allies and 40 Americans on that first flight of 380. But that is only part of the story. The true heroism exists in the faces of each of you in this room, who, despite the fact that you reached out for help from our federal government, you got no answer. Now, Mr. Syed was able to not only navigate a caravan of 40 vehicles north over an 8-hour journey. We asked him, would you please pick up 2 young women whose husband has gone missing? They were students, and on Monday, they were going to university. By the middle of the week, they were beaten in the street because they did not have a head covering. Their future was one of rape and forced marriage. But for Mr. Syed, He put them in the back of his Toyota Corolla with his small children, and together they made this journey north. They were stopped multiple times throughout the night by the Taliban, and they were asked time and time again, who are these women? And he would say, I am their grandfather. We're going to a wedding. But this cover story was not developed out of thin air. It was the work of volunteers who helped at every checkpoint report back on what was going on, who helped provide a clean pathway and made sure that there was a safe harbor when they arrived in Mazar Sharif. And over the course of the next weeks that turned into months, flight after flight saved these individuals. There are many of you who are on this panel today, and I cannot thank you enough. This digital Dunkirk, this rescue from Afghanistan is a direct reflection of what you did to save these lives, the lives of people who had spent decades saving ours. So with that, France, I want to first of all commend you and everything that you did to help evacuate with your team and the hundreds of volunteers behind the scenes, not just here, but around the world who did that. I want to speak specifically to the issue of flying folks out of Mazar Sharif. Was the U.S. State Department or the Taliban the harder force in being able to get those aircraft off the ground and save those lives?
They were equally hard, Congressman. I mean, in both cases, both were operating from a place of confusion, of lack of information, and lack of authority. Literally, both sides of the government coin.
Adrian, I'd like to speak to you on what the U.S. government's, was there ever a single point of contact within State Department that you could reach out to, that you had the ability to, Colonel, to actually have a conversation to seek evacuation?
There was not, Congressman, really, that we ever found. What we found that worked very well was Aiden's unit in particular was very responsive and looking to do more, and they had what seemed to be a very good working relationship with State Department at Apron 8 for out-processing. So we really relied on them to do that. We could never figure out how to do that direct engagement.
And France, you talk about a moral obligation that we have. Is there also a national security implication for what has occurred?
Congressman, when we left Afghanistan, we not only left behind allies, we left behind our honor. We left behind our credibility. If we want allies to fight alongside us in the future, we need to be credible when we tell them that we're going to stand by them. We need the strategic option of working by, with, and through allies in the future. And without the credibility that comes from standing by the allies in Afghanistan, we're not going to get that cooperation in future fights. And then we're going to have to either choose as a nation to be less effective on the global stage or choose to spend more of America's blood and treasure to achieve the same outcomes.
France, thank you. Mr. Chair, my appreciation, because what was our darkest hour in Afghanistan is made better by the actions that each of you took to be able to save lives and chart a better course for our country. We on this panel owe it to you to be able to get answers and truth so this never happens again. With that, Mr. Chair, thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Before I close, I'd like to recognize the ranking member for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first thank all of our esteemed witnesses for appearing before our committee today. And I said it once and I say it again. Let me really thank you also for saving and evacuating over 120,000 people in 17 days under the most difficult conditions imaginable in a complex and dangerous environment thousands of miles away. I want to thank you. There were successes in this evacuation, and there were mistakes. We need to acknowledge both. I want to particularly thank and also commend all of you who worked to help not only our Afghan allies and partners, but also for being advocates for the rights and pathways of refugees and immigrants more broadly. Ms. Mackler, your work in particular, including for coordinating legal services for those impacted by the Muslim ban in my own district at JFK Airport, lays bare how much more work we need to do in Congress to fix our broken immigration system. And as I said in my opening remarks again, extricating ourselves from 2 decades of a quagmire in Afghanistan was always going to be a difficult task. And I believe that we are deluding ourselves if we believe that this could have been as an easy operation given the deteriorating security situation and rapidly changing events on the ground that no one could have predicted. This undertaking was further complicated by sets of policies, and these are just facts, policy decisions made by the previous administration that altered the balance of power in Afghanistan and hindered our ability to honor our commitment to thousands of brave Afghans who stood side by side with us over the course of the past 2 decades. And yes, I must say that I am deeply concerned by some of my colleagues who paint the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan with such broad strokes as to divorce the emergency evacuation from those choices and the full context that led up to the events in August 2021. They don't stand, that doesn't happen in a vacuum and by itself. I believe we must commit ourselves to responsible, bipartisan oversight, and we must ensure that we are taking a sober look at how we reached this outcome in Afghanistan after 20 years of war. But we also must look at how we can prevent the same mistakes from going and being made again going forward. And yet, under the most challenging circumstances, you, along with our diplomats and intelligence professionals, mobilized this whole of government effort to evacuate American citizens. There are important lessons to be learned from mistakes that were made. Yet the impossible has also happened. Due to your tireless work, the State Department and other U.S. government personnel, lives were saved. And I couldn't help but feel, as I said in the beginning, when I think of all, and I think we need to recognize and honor all 2,461 members of the United States military that lost their lives during this 20 years of war. And as I close and yield back, I just want to, because I just was reflecting, ask unanimous consent, being a member from New York, I just wanted to put in the record the names of the 112 members of the United States military that lost their lives in this war that came from my state of New York. To the Gold Star families here, and to those that may be listening, to those that I have met and talked to in regards to the 20 years, including the evacuation, my heart, my prayers, my soul reaches out to you. And those of us that sits in the United States Congress, we also take the responsibility that we have to pass the legislation that we need to do to make sure that this does not happen again. With that, I ask for these.
And without objection, so ordered. And let me just say, it's my 10th term in Congress, and I don't think I've had a more powerful experience with a hearing. All of you stood up in a time when our government did not, and let down people that were left behind, from American citizens to Afghan partners who are still there, to all the women, and my heart really goes out to them on International Women's Day, as they now live under the Taliban and Sharia law, that never probably have experienced it. Many have not. And it's been a dark chapter, but as the ranking member said, what you did is a bright light in terms of saving so many countless lives. And we got the briefings here in Washington, but you just gave us all a front row seat to what really happened that day. And it was incredibly powerful, the testimony from all of you. What are we leaving behind? We know China's there. The DNI testified in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee today on the global terrorism threat in Afghanistan. She says Al-Qaeda viewed the Taliban seizure of power as a victory for the global jihad, and Al-Qaeda remains committed to attacking U.S. interests. And on ISIS, Khorasan almost certainly retains the intent to conduct operations in the West and will continue efforts to attack outside of Afghanistan. I pray the threat goes away, but I'm not as naive to think it will. I was a counterterrorism federal prosecutor. I was chairman of the Homeland Security Committee when we stopped so many of these threats to conduct external operations in the United States of America. So for the veteran out there listening, was it worth it? Yes, it was worth it. You protected America. And some gave their lives to protect America and what it stands for. And we do have to learn from the mistakes of the past, and we'll continue to do that. But I just want to thank you for what you've done for the veteran, you know, whether it's saving lives, whether it's the PTSD, whether it's a suicide rates, which we know are going up after what happened. And we also know that this has had a projection of weakness that has invited aggression and war from Putin in Ukraine to Chairman Xi's threatening the Pacific. There is a cause and effect. And we know that after August, when Afghanistan fell, the Russian Federation, we saw it, the surveillance videos, the satellite imagery of the Russian Federation moving to Ukraine. And that is the axiom of history, that peace through strength, weakness invites aggression. I hope we can project strength and stop war like this one. And I just want to say to anyone listening to this, I know it's being carried live on C-SPAN and a lot of other outlets. If you have any information about the withdrawal in Afghanistan, please don't hesitate to contact our House Foreign Affairs website at foreignaffairs.house.gov. We simply want to get the truth out. And as I said in my opening statement, our veterans deserve it, and our Gold Star mothers and families deserve the truth. And people do need to be held accountable. Nothing demonstrates that more so than your powerful testimony about having the suicide bomber in your grasp, and he got away, and what we could have stopped. But for some decision made above you not to respond to that threat. That's probably one of the saddest things out of this hearing, and we pray for you and all the veterans out there. And we want to say thank you on behalf of the United States Congress, both Republican and Democrat. So with that, we're going to close the hearing. Thank the witnesses. Members may have additional questions, and you may submit those in writing pursuant to committee rules. All members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record. And without objection, the committee stands adjourned.